In the 2007 Assassin's Creed cinematic trailer, the main protagonist is shown combing through a crowd of people with a crossbow on his back. This weapon has never been actually put into the final game. The only long-range weapon in the first Assassin's Creed game were the throwing knives. In this trailer, the crossbow is used twice, which most people missed at the time. Some even remember the crossbow being thrown and not shot. In reality, the crossbow is not only being shot, but then used on another enemy a couple seconds later. Now, the reasons for the crossbow weapon being absent in the final game are handful. Some believe the reason is simply that Altair, the protagonist, had to leave the weapon behind, as shown in the trailer. Others think that the weapon would break a lot of the missions in the game or made them too easy. The IMDb's trivia also states the crossbow would be historically inaccurate, which is not exactly true. Curiously, while the first ever game of the franchise mentions the crossbow and subsequently not featuring it, in the mobile spin-off Altair's Chronicles, a crossbow is featured as a weapon. That is one of many examples when video game trailers have not been entirely accurate or downright deceitful. But, as with everything else, even these inaccuracies did have a reason, which I will cover towards the end of this video. What Naughty Dog did with their initial The Last of Us Part 2 trailer was much more deliberate and intentional. As one of the very first trailers made, fans would have no idea what the exact story behind Part 2 was going to be, and most would ask why is Ellie so upset and bloodthirsty. Of course, it didn't take long for the dedicated fans to come up with loads of theories, one of them being that Joel, the father figure for Ellie, would have been killed or kidnapped. This theory was soon dismantled when the cinematic trailer for Part 2 revealed Joel finding Ellie in the middle of enemy territory.
What the hell are you doing here?
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
Except that this cutscene never actually showed Joel in the actual game, but another character, Jesse.
What the hell are you doing here?
I think I'd let you do this on your own.
This change was no accident, as Joel's character was killed early on, just like predicted. Paired with Ellie's strong PTSD episodes, most players assume that Joel appears in this cutscene as some kind of a hallucination, foreshadowing that Ellie is losing her mind throughout the game. Needless to say that the reality was quite different in the story and only made the entire game a bit more confusing. Cyberpunk 2077 was beaten to death over the years when it comes to unfulfilled promises. We all know that CDPR didn't quite deliver on everything, even though in the eyes of a lot of players, they redeemed themselves with the Phantom Liberty DLC. One thing that stuck out in the many gameplay trailers was the Mantis blades, which were shown to let the players climb walls with. Out of so many different features that were cut from the final product, this one seemed like it could have been added at any point. Luckily, for this one we actually already have a concrete explanation. Max Pierce, the level designer, was interviewed by Game Reactor about this very feature. According to him, this specific ability was removed for design reasons. It's not exactly a 4-page detailed explanation, but at least we know it wasn't just something lost to time. What upsets me as someone who has over 600 hours in Cyberpunk is how cool would be a combination of Mantis blades wall running and double jump, giving you a true vertical freedom in Night City. In BioShock Infinite, we do get a lot of promised features, but maybe just not to the same extent as was shown in the 2011 E3 demo. Elizabeth is capable of opening these portals to other dimensions, as is very relevant to the game's complex story. In the actual game, Elizabeth does help you out by summoning these small portals that can get you ammo or health. It's somewhat of an upgrade to her, sometimes throwing you some of these items as you play, which on its own was pretty cool companion feature. What she cannot do though is open these portals and completely change the map, which, if you follow the E3 demo, is very much hinted at. Not to mention that this entire sequence was also interpreted by the fans as one of many choices you will be making in the game, which was not really the case. It's obviously not something easy to do, changing the entire game just by opening a portal. More so if it's supposed to be a choice the player makes and not a cutscene. Which brings us to the obvious explanation as to why this even was mentioned in the demo at all. Simply, the devs were a little big in over their head and wanted to show off a new feature that really was later added, just in much more manageable manner. We can at least find a certain comfort in that Elizabeth didn't end up having the ability to send us into a future where even more Star Wars movies were made. Days Gone had to deal with a similar backlash. This gameplay trailer from E3 2016 mainly focused on the Horde mechanic, which did feature in the final version of the game and worked pretty well. The deception has actually come later when the main character is stuck inside an empty building with a zombie. Here we see it could be possible to cut off the zombie's limbs off and then use environment to finish it off. Both of these are not featured in the game, although there's been plenty of changes to the final game that supplemented this mechanic with others. The main concern with the limbs was Sony's PG rating, which at the time many assumed was the reason this didn't make it through the development. Later, it turned out the real reason this feature hasn't come to fruition was actually much simpler. The game version that originally had this option had to have an animation for armless or legless zombies, which on its own would need a separate animation and unique attacks. Not to mention that tearing limbs off hundreds of zombies in the aforementioned Horde would be way too process intensive for PlayStation 4 hardware. Hardware issues, however, is not what stopped Techland from fulfilling their own promises with Dying Light 2. While the game definitely seen improvements over the first iteration, as many other trailers, even this one partakes in a deception. The first clue was always the way this conversation is handled. No transition, quick thinking and fast response. Not quite how the real game handles dialogue, but while this was definitely a scripted event that Techland intentionally tried to pass as gameplay, what was much more deceitful was the implication that this choice will have a big impact on a larger scale in the game's story. Ultimately fork the outcome of the game just by changing your mind in the last minute. Now obviously this is not exactly a small detail, rather a big lie surrounded by smaller ones. A classic behavior of a bloodthirsty publishers. The reason for this specific part to change so drastically is simply the amount of direction the real game needed to even allow players to change the story without breaking the game. It's not far-fetched to assume that Techland wanted to sell the idea far more than the actual product. We still ended up playing a great game with a decent story, just not with the amount of freedom the trailer has promised.
Your own city from the apocalypse. Each player's game experience will be unique.
And now for the promised conclusion. I have covered different range and scale of details in trailers across almost 20 years in the game industry. Has the lying gotten better or worse? It's not an easy question. The truth is most, if not all of trailers presented at video game conventions or shows are not presented for gamers. True, most of us view trailers and teasers as an exciting way to get ready for a release in distant future. The real reason for these trailers, especially the nice and animated cinematic short movies look often so different, or present much more polished version of the game that we receive, is that these presentations are just finished concepts that often still need much more time and funding. Even giant companies that are owned by even bigger companies still need an approval. These trailers are costly, but they serve as investment for the publishers to test the market and give the big paying sponsors an idea of the product that can eat millions in the future. Most of these trailers are often a fantasy cooked up by the devs, not for us, but for the silent money behind the curtain making the decisions. Often enough, a good-looking game doesn't see light of day for years or at all. In a process of making a good impression, a creative freedom compels many studios to let loose a little with their imagination, if not to flat out manipulate both you, the consumer, but also the mentioned corporations.